Are you ready?
I would move.
A little wind right now. Are you ready? Pretty good?
It's April 2022, somewhere in Baja California, Mexico. From a camper van, Luke Eisman, founder of a US startup called Make Sunsets, is filling up 2 weather balloons. They contain a mixture of helium and the gas sulfur dioxide.
Ready?
What you're listening to is actually a video from the company's YouTube channel of a different balloon launch in 2023. As the balloons are released into the Mexican skies, Eisman hopes that when the balloons burst high up in the atmosphere, the sulfur dioxide particles will disperse, reflecting sunlight and helping to cool the Earth. It's a crude form of a controversial geoengineering technology called solar radiation modification or solar radiation management, known as SRM. The company says it does not know what happened to the balloons. But when details of the experiment emerged nearly a year later, it caused outrage in Mexico, which was unaware of the test. The Mexican government banned any further geoengineering testing. It also drafted new regulations to prohibit solar geoengineering inside the country. Make Sunsets moved its experiments to the US, and it says it's now launched 81 balloons and is actively looking for investors to help it launch more. This case is a stark example of what happens when theoretical ideas about modifying the climate collide with the real world. Few people are willing to accept untested technologies being released into the atmosphere above their own backyard. This is the second of 2 episodes from the conversation on the debate about climate geoengineering. In the first episode, we spoke to 2 academics about the case for research into climate geoengineering and the science behind it. In this second episode, we hear the case against it, focusing mainly on this particular type of geoengineering called solar radiation modification. We speak to 2 researchers worried it might threaten the political sovereignty of nations in the global south and distract attention away from reducing fossil fuel emissions in the first place. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts.
It shouldn't be seen as a coincidence that the first place, as far as we know, for this rogue company to test to go and shoot some of the SRM balloons into the atmosphere was Mexico.
This is Chukwumerije Okereke. He's a professor of global governance and public policy at the University of Bristol in the UK and co-director of the Centre for Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekwueme Federal University in Nigeria.
I worry that if people like me don't raise their voices and call these people out, Africa will ultimately be one of the continents that will be targeted for a rogue testing of SRM technology.
Chukwumerije's research focuses on international collaboration as the world transitions to a greener path for growth, and how to make sure countries in the global south get a fair deal in that transition. At the same time, he's become a prominent figure among those who oppose the implementation of solar radiation management, SRM, and he's particularly worried about the risks it poses for the African continent.
It is entirely possible to imagine a situation where Africa will be a victim because people will find it, quote unquote, an easy target as a place to test some of these unproven technologies. And we can see that this is already kind of happening in the way in which some of the leading proponents in terms of institutions have been approaching African policymakers, seeking to cajole them, to woo them, to support SRM.
What initially triggered your concern about climate engineering?
The key thing that triggered my concern about climate engineering is a passion, a desire to ensure that efforts to address climate change do not increase inequality, exacerbate poverty, or make matters worse in terms of justice and fairness for the global south and Africa in particular. I think it is entirely possible to imagine a situation where efforts to solve or to address climate change globally can make matters worse for those who have contributed the least to climate change and currently bear the greatest brunt, not just in terms of climate, but also in terms of development, in terms of inequality, in terms of poverty.
Your key concern is solar radiation management. This is technologies, and there are a multitude of them, with the goal of dimming sunlight to reduce the temperature of the Earth. And so you're not against all climate geoengineering per se. Can you outline for me your main opposition to solar geoengineering?
Number one, I think they are untested, they are risky, and that they run the risk of exacerbating the problem of climate change. In the sense that for these things to work, the experiment has to be done on a global scale, and they don't solve the problem. They mask, as you said, the amount of sunlight reaching the planet, but then it has to continue in perpetuity, because anytime that you stop masking the sunlight, then you can actually unleash all the, if you like, the cooling effect that you have been able to achieve through this engineering. And then you can have what we call the termination shock.
The theory is that if SRM were used to diminish global warming and then abruptly stopped, temperatures would quickly and harmfully rise. This is known as termination shock, a key point of debate in the field.
Africa is already warming faster than the rest of the world, most parts of Africa, at least, because of its proximity to the equator. So should a termination shock occur, it is clearly conceivable, and in fact probable, I would argue, that current countries that are actually already bearing the brunt of climate change will be the ones that will suffer the most. So it will be again Africa, which has been widely recognized as one of the most vulnerable, if not the most vulnerable continent in the world. But it will also be countries like the small island states who are already also bearing the great impact of climate change. And I also like to warn my friends in the global north that they will not be exempted, because we are also experiencing huge impacts of climate change around the world, in Germany, in US, in UK, and other parts of the world. Of course, they do have the stronger technology and financial and infrastructural capability to cope, but no one will be spared at the end of the day. So this is not just an African issue.
And you've argued strongly, including in an opinion article for the New York Times in 2023, that Africa should not be used as a climate laboratory. Why are you particularly worried about Africa and its potential use as a testing ground?
Because African governments, given their structural weakness historically in international relationships, if these technologies are allowed to be used, to be tested at global scale or at continental scale, we can easily imagine a situation where some of the testing will be done in Africa for a start. And there are examples of people who are already trying to convince African countries that they need to back this technology and open their borders for these technologies to be tested in Africa. And it just reminds me of previous examples when rich countries didn't have any much problem in using African people or Africa as a guinea pig, if you like, to test dangerous drugs.
A number of unethical vaccine and drug trials have been conducted on the African continent. In many cases, participants were not adequately informed about the nature of the trials or the potential risks and side effects of the drugs.
It does also happen to be the case that in most cases, African voices are not really taken very seriously in global governance issues. Remember when African countries were begging for COVID vaccine, the generic form of it, and nobody gave them. Instead, there were a lot of imposition of travel bans on African countries, including those who were quite upfront in helping to identify some of the variants of the COVID, like South Africa.
It feels like there is concern mounting in Africa about this. At a meeting in February at the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi, there was an initial proposal to set up a working group to examine the benefits and risks of solar radiation modification, and that was withdrawn, pushed really as an issue by a group of African countries. Can you explain what happened?
I was one of those that were fully against that proposal and helped to mobilize the support of African countries to vote it down. The idea that, we want to use this to help Africa seems to me very disingenuous. If you want to help Africa, how about investing significantly in renewable energy technology? How about the transfer of proven technologies, wind and solar? How about scaling up climate finance for Africa? How about putting more money for loss and damage? Just a few months when the COP was going on in Egypt, a huge part of Pakistan, nearly 40% of Pakistan, was lying underwater. And a few weeks before then, a significant amount of Nigeria was also inundated by an unprecedented degree of flooding. Nigeria received next to nothing from anybody in order to help to deal with that challenge. At a time that African countries are struggling to pay off their debt, and many of them are being described as debt distress, why don't we concentrate on how we can cancel some of these debts or reschedule them or pause them and get them to really pour more resources into scaling up renewable energy uptake in this country, which is, by the way, necessary to solve the issue of energy access. I think part of the problem is that people are always thinking about climate change in isolation to other social and economic development objectives, which are a priority for many poor countries. Anyway, so I don't buy the argument that has been presented by some that this is a way to help Africa. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's pure nonsense.
So you actually felt that even by having the proposal to examine the benefits and risks of solar radiation management on the agenda of this meeting, that it was legitimizing the debate, and that's what you were against?
You've put it very correctly. There is a slippery slope that is emerging, where people will say, well, let's just research the risks and benefits, and then in so doing, gradually legitimize the research and ultimately the testing and use of this technology. It's a distraction. We already have proven technology. What are you researching? We have technologies that can solve this problem tomorrow. The problem we have is that they need to be deployed in large scale. We need to be also attending to the supply side of global climate policy by limiting the use of fossil fuel and other high-emitting substances such as methane. But really the biggest opportunity we have in climate governance is to deploy massively proven technologies in renewable energy. So I just don't understand that argument, to be honest. I already have a solution. Of course, they don't have this sort of risk associated with what you're trying to pour billions to do. Use those billions to solve the problems with proven technologies. I think it's quite simple. I'm not calling for a total ban on research, on SRM, but the way it's going, we think everybody needs to take a breath, pause, establish a moratorium, try and establish some kind of a governance arrangement that will guide, very, very rigorous one, set out a clear parameter for the research and how it's going to be done.
Chukwumerije told me he's pleased that a number of African countries managed to come together in opposition to the proposal made at the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi. But he's also concerned that companies involved in pushing solar geoengineering technologies will persist in seeking testing grounds in regions with weaker governance. To get a clearer understanding of the challenges to governing technologies like geoengineering, I reached out to an expert at the forefront of calls for a global non-use agreement on solar geoengineering.
There's an argument around climate justice that we need to research these technologies in order to potentially alleviate suffering in the future of those most vulnerable. And I was also interested in how that was being used as a rationale to push for solar geoengineering, when in fact, on climate justice grounds, one might be very concerned about the potential unknowable and unequally distributed consequences of developing and deploying solar geoengineering.
Aarti Gupta is a professor of global environmental governance and politics at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She began her academic career researching the management of novel technologies, such as genetically modified crops in India. She was then invited to join a group of researchers looking into the potential governance of geoengineering. In 2021, she co-wrote a paper arguing that the deployment of solar geoengineering at a planetary scale would require entirely new international governance organisations. Aarti, in this paper you wrote in 2021 about this, there's a powerful line in which you say that these kind of international governance organisations with convincing means of democratic control and unprecedented enforcement powers just don't exist. What then are the particular governance challenges on a planetary scale for solar radiation management?
What we would require, in essence, is some form of world government And so in the absence of that, it's very difficult to envision what kind of governance arrangements would be both legitimate and effective, but also stable across decades and centuries, and would allow for a democratic decision-making about these matters. I think the challenges are the same if there is a planetary scale impact, and if other techniques are scalable to have a planetary scale impact. From my perspective, any SRM technique that has a planetary scale effect or seeks to have one raises the same sorts of governance challenges.
Aarti singles out solar radiation management from other types of climate geoengineering, mainly because it's the technology with a potential planetary scale impact that's getting the most attention at the moment. One of the biggest concerns for her is that it could delay companies and governments from reducing emissions from fossil fuels.
The clear and present danger today, which is of enormous concern, is that just keeping the SRM option on the table, researching it, funding it, talking about it, can have this effect of delaying the urgent decarbonization that we need, the transition, the just transition to renewables. This phenomenon, which also goes by the term mitigation deterrence, is notoriously difficult to document empirically. It's very difficult to trace an immediate causal link between talking about or researching or calling for SRM to be retained as a potential future climate policy option and a direct mitigation deterrent effect. But that risk that this might be the case in this urgent decade is a risk we cannot afford to take.
Aarti points to technologies such as carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, which she says might serve as an excuse to continue producing oil and delay urgent climate action.
Those who are most averse to doing what we need to do urgently, whether that's oil-producing countries, whether it's fossil fuel companies, as long as there's a potential promise of something being available in the future which reduces the urgency of current action, that's going to be used. So that has been a concern for that CDR, instead of serving as a complement or a supplement to ambitious emission reductions, might in fact become a substitute. And we are just very worried that the same dynamic might come to pass with SRM. Every ton of carbon dioxide emitted while we're talking about SRM is a huge problem. And that's a risk we just simply cannot afford to take, especially given that this may not be the panacea that some might think it would, or not even a panacea, but it may make the problem worse. So it's not a solution, but it distracts us from what we know we need to do today.
In 2022, Aarti was part of a group of researchers who put together a solar geoengineering non-use agreement.
I would say until about 2019, 2020, it was still a conversation largely amongst academics and scientists, but those of us who were worried and critical about SRM and the governance challenges and the potential risks, the unknowable risks, we started to see that there were a number of developments in the policy space, but also calls by elite institutions like the NAS, the US National Academy, which came out in 2021 with a report calling on the US government to establish a research program on SRM.
This report by the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, on one hand, emphasised that solar geoengineering is not a substitute for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it also recommended that given the urgency of the risks posed by climate change, the US should pursue a research program for solar geoengineering.
There were also elite journals like Nature and Science saying, let's give SRM research a chance, this might be necessary. So we thought this is a crucial, critical moment where even though, and it's very important to say, the push for SRM was then still very much confined to a small group of elite institutions, largely based in the US, funded by Silicon Valley investors and tech billionaires. And so the push for SRM is still from a small group, but a group with outsized influence. And this was entering the policy arena, being picked up by media, being given more airtime, being normalized as a potential future climate policy option that should be considered. And we thought this is a very dangerous set of developments.
In an open letter, Aarti and her colleagues called for 5 key commitments. No public funding, no outdoor experiments, no patents, no deployment, and no support in international institutions. The open letter has now been signed by more than 500 academics from more than 60 countries and endorsed by over 2,000 civil society organizations.
We see our role as providing this critical scientific grounding for the position of non-use and for calling on political actors, governments and the UN to act. And that's what we will continue to do. So we don't suggest that scientists decide these things, but that political actors should act to basically take SRM off the table as a future climate policy option.
Are there any precedents for this type of non-use agreement with technology?
We have examples of restrictive global governance of chemical weapons and biological weapons, or the weaponized use of certain technological innovations. If we think about novel technologies, one could think about human cloning. That's something that we could potentially do. We could develop the technological means and the technical know-how, but we have decided that's something that we don't want to do. We think SRM is another one of those technologies which, yes, we could develop the technical expertise, but it's something that we perhaps shouldn't reach that point. We shouldn't develop the scientific understanding and knowledge and development of the technology to the point where it could actually be used, because the use of it will not be decided by scientists.
I know that your non-use agreement started off in the academic space, and as it's been rumbling along, they've also started to become quite a lot more resistant to real-world experiments of this. So Mexico banned solar engineering in 2023 after a US startup did an unauthorized experiment. And then there was an attempt to test solar radiation technology in Sweden near the Arctic Circle that was blocked by the Swedish government after opposition, including from some indigenous groups. That was under the umbrella of this large ScopeX project. And then just recently in March, Harvard announced that was being closed and that technology would be put to another use. So it does seem that as these technologies get tried or people try to test them in real world experiments, they're meeting real political blocks. What's your reaction to that?
I think that is absolutely telling. And it's telling because it shows that when political actors or societal actors start to consider SRM, the response has always, I think, categorically been restrictive. So the examples that you outlined, the minute that something is actually out there to be tried and tested, the response is to restrict it because of overriding concerns around the risks and the unmanageability, the governance challenges, and that this is not the answer to the climate crisis. That is also to be seen at the global governance level as well. So we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which in 2010 already was a decision by governments. It's a non-binding decision, but it's still a decision by governments to say that there should be no climate engineering unless proven safe.
Since then, there have been other attempts to discuss the use of geoengineering on a global scale, including the UN Environment Meeting in Nairobi back in February that we heard about from Chukwumerije.
The majority of countries, if you look at the African group of countries, they came out very strongly for a non-use mechanism to be acknowledged as important in this space in Nairobi. And this was supported by other developing countries, by small island developing states as well. And this Nairobi discussion also showed that those who are promoting research is, again, a very small group. It was largely the US pushing for this conversation to continue in climate scientific fora like, the World Climate Research Program, etc., not necessarily political multilateral arenas like the UN. But the majority voices concerned.
To bring more attention to their concerns over SRM technologies, Aarti and some of her colleagues behind the push for a non-use agreement are organising a dialogue at the UN General Assembly in September. As part of the UN's Science Week, this meeting will bring together academics and policymakers to talk about SRM.
What we have said already in our open call, etc., is that even a resolution at some point in the future by the UN General Assembly could be a very powerful signal. We need a norm shift towards non-use, and that can come from different spaces.
So how do advocates of geoengineering respond to criticisms like Chukwumerije's and Aarti's? In our previous episode, we heard from Shaun Fitzgerald and Hugh Hunt, who are researching various types of climate engineering at the Centre for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge. I asked them what they thought of the criticism that developing these kind of technologies might delay essential climate emissions mitigation. Some critics worry that people will see geoengineering, these types of projects, as a way to expand how much carbon we could continue to pump into the atmosphere with impunity. And they worry that this means governments, companies will perhaps put off some of the larger changes that they need to make to prevent more emissions and more climate catastrophe.
Actually, what's really interesting is that there have been some focus groups that were conducted. It's published research. And in fact, when you ask people about what the options are, and then, because most people haven't heard of these climate engineering ideas, some of these people in the focus groups, when they've learned what sorts of things are being considered, like spraying sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, they've said, really? And in fact, the net result has been an increase in resolve to wean oneself off the use of fossil fuels. There's more evidence that, in fact, this might actually increase the effort that we put into basically doing what's right. And, both Hugh and I are absolutely adamant. This is not an excuse and must not be an excuse for just keeping on the oil drug, the gas drug. No, we've got to wean ourselves off very quickly. And in fact, if this helps us in that transition, then even more power to the society's elbow to seriously consider these sorts of interventions.
Shaun told me he'd be the happiest person on Earth if none of the research he and his colleagues are doing ever gets deployed.
In other words, that society has decided to go and do emissions reduction and scale of greenhouse gas removal beyond our wildest dreams, beyond any scenario that's been considered by the IPCC, and I think that's very unlikely. But I would be very happy. But I think, therefore, what we do need to do is to equip society with knowledge about these other options. And it's not for me, or I think any individual, to say we are going to determine and decide what's going to be the right thing for the world to pursue. But at the moment, the very minimum that the likes of you and I can do is to do our absolute damnedest to increase our knowledge base about the other options that the world could potentially consider to try and, for example, keep the ice on Antarctica, the ice on Greenland.
I put this point back to Aarti Gupta for her reaction. I've spoken to a couple of advocates, scientists who are working on geoengineering, that their argument is that yes, it's possible that something may go wrong with SRM or other types of climate engineering, but that the world is at great risk from global warming right now without a solution like geoengineering, and that they believe it's better to explore the possibility to have the options on the table rather than not. I wonder what you say to that type of argument.
We are united in that concern about climate change, so that's not the area of disagreement. The disagreement is whether SRM offers a way to ameliorate or make that situation worse. And in our view, adding SRM into the mix will make the situation much worse. So it could exacerbate climate impacts and unequal climate impacts. That's why we suggest that it is not the answer to an accelerating climate crisis. We cannot use the argument that we haven't done enough to then say, let's keep this speculative and highly dangerous option on the table. Our argument is keeping this option on the table will guarantee a further failure to act. If there was no other alternative but to massively reduce our emissions and to have a just transition, then that would be where our resources, our time and our attention would go. If we go down that path and we do even less than we are doing now to reduce emissions, and there's an accumulation that could have, of course, a severe warming effect if we were able to remove this masking effect of SRM, the artificial cooling effect. So that termination shock is, of course, a huge concern. So more broadly, we don't think that SRM is the answer.
Aarti stresses she's not arguing for ignorance.
The very pat and very easy criticism is to say, how can you argue not to develop knowledge? How can you argue against academic freedom? How can you argue for ignorance? And I personally find that particular claim that we are arguing for ignorance to be an ignorant claim, if I could put it that way, because that is clearly not what a large and growing group of academics is going to call for, that we are on the side of ignorance. We just think that it's extremely dangerous to pursue certain technological interventions that could make a very compelling existential sort of crisis much worse and could have very unequal impacts. That's why we speak out. And so I'm going to continue to speak out and try to bring the very compelling critical voices on this together. So yes, it's challenging, but it feels very important.
You've been listening to The Conversation Weekly. We'll put a few links in our show notes to further reading from the conversation about climate engineering, including articles by Chukwumerije Okereke and Aarti Gupta. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani, with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the host and executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. And if you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com. Please also do rate and review the show wherever you listen. It helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks very much for listening.